In the bitter winter of 1802, 15 souls vanished along a cursed stretch of mountain trail in western Virginia. Each disappeared without warning, leaving behind only empty saddles and possessions that whispered no tales of their owner's fate. What transforms these vanishings from mere frontier tragedy into something far more sinister is the deliberate destruction of every official record that followed. For over 2 centuries, the truth about the Morrison family homestead lay buried beneath courthouse fires and missing documents, until a historian's accidental discovery in 1994 unveiled the most methodical killing operation in colonial American history. The records describe a murder enterprise so perfectly disguised as frontier hospitality that it flourished for 9 years without suspicion. Before we delve deeper into this tale of the homestead that became Virginia's Chamber of Horrors, remember to subscribe to the Holloway archives and activate notifications. We're about to expose secrets that influential families spent fortunes to erase forever. Tell us in the comments which region you're watching from. We cherish hearing from our community of truth seekers. The revelation that would ultimately expose the Morrison family's atrocities began not with midnight screams, but with the mundane task of archival organization in a forgotten university basement. Western Virginia in 1802 existed as a realm suspended between order and chaos, where dreams of fortune lured thousands westward through treacherous mountain passages. The Great Indian Trail, blazed by Cherokee hunters generations before white settlement, had evolved into the primary route for families migrating west from the Carolinas and Pennsylvania. This narrow, winding path stretched over 300 miles through some of the most... Along this perilous route, dozens of small settlements had emerged like mushrooms after summer rain. Each represented hope for families pursuing fresh starts in the untamed wilderness. These communities functioned as vital rest stops, where weary travelers could recuperate, gather supplies, and collect intelligence about the perils awaiting them ahead. The survival of these settlements often hinged on their capacity to offer sanctuary to the endless stream of migrants passing through their boundaries. The village of Willowbrook occupied a strategic position where the trail descended from granite peaks into the lush valley of Serpents Creek. With scarcely 400 residents, it embodied the type of place where everyone monitored everyone else's affairs, or believed they did. The settlement had been founded in 1796 by a congregation of Presbyterian refugees seeking religious liberty, and their influence permeated every aspect of community existence. Sabbath worship was compulsory for all inhabitants, and the town council enforced rigid moral standards governing everything from gambling to music. The community centered around Mackenzie's Trading Post, a sturdy stone building serving as both commercial hub and unofficial courthouse. Duncan Mackenzie, a weathered former scout who had tracked outlaws alongside legendary lawmen, operated the establishment with stern authority and sharp business instincts. His store contained everything a wayfarer might require: ammunition, preserved meat, spirits, wool blankets, and the freshest intelligence from civilized territories beyond the mountains. Adjacent stood the Willowbrook Lodge, a 3-story edifice representing the pinnacle of wilderness luxury. Eleanor Blackwood, the refined widow who managed the settlement's moral center, was Covenant Presbyterian Church, a humble stone structure capable of housing the entire population during Sunday services. Reverend Nathaniel Webb, a Princeton-educated clergyman who had forsaken a comfortable Philadelphia parish for frontier ministry, delivered sermons combining orthodox doctrine with practical wisdom for surviving in an unforgiving land. His presence provided Willowbrook with legitimacy that attracted settlers who might otherwise have continued their journey without pause. Among Willowbrook's most esteemed citizens were the Morrisons, Obadiah, his spouse Charity, and their 3 grown offspring, sons Abel and Seth, and daughter Faith. The family had arrived in autumn 1793, professing to be survivors of devastating Cherokee raids that had destroyed their former residence in eastern North Carolina. They rapidly established themselves as community cornerstones, with Obadiah serving as assistant minister who supported Reverend Webb in charity, organizing relief efforts for destitute families arriving with nothing but their clothing. Obadiah Morrison commanded reverence through pure force of character. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with the massive frame of a lifelong woodsman, he possessed the kind of imposing presence that made grown men step respectfully aside when he approached. His thunderous voice could fill the church effortlessly, delivering sermons that moved congregants to weeping with passionate descriptions of divine mercy. More than one household owed their survival to her pre-dawn visits during medical emergencies, and her reputation for healing miracles had spread throughout the county. Their children seemed perfect examples of frontier righteousness. Abel, the eldest son at 28, combined his father's commanding physical stature with his mother's compassionate nature. He cultivated the family land with relentless devotion while finding time to assist aging neighbors with their harvest. Seth, 26, was smaller but more scholarly, frequently serving as the community's informal educator during winter months when agricultural work diminished. At 24, Faith was regarded as one of the most lovely young women in the region, with a gentle spirit that endeared her to both men and women. The Morrison homestead sprawled across 500 acres of fertile valley floor along Serpent's Creek, 4 miles south of town. The property had cost Obadiah nearly his entire fortune, but the purchase had proven worthwhile. The rich earth yielded bountiful harvests of wheat and hemp, while the creeks supplied water for livestock and power for a modest grain mill serving neighboring farms. Visitors often commented on the homestead's remarkable prosperity, noting that the Morrisons appeared to possess more material wealth than farming alone could explain. Obadiah had constructed his settlement with meticulous attention to both luxury and defense. The primary residence was a 3-story log edifice with fieldstone chimneys and glazed windows, an almost unimaginable extravagance on the frontier. The chambers, what made the Morrisons particularly valuable to the community, was their eagerness to assist distressed travelers. The frontier showed no mercy to those journeying alone or unprepared, and scarcely a week passed without someone arriving at the homestead seeking aid. Repeatedly, Obadiah had ventured out in hazardous conditions to help with damaged wagons or injured livestock, often inviting stranded parties to shelter at his property until repairs could be completed. Such generosity was considered a Christian obligation on the frontier, but the Morrisons extended it to extraordinary degrees. Charity was especially renowned for her readiness to treat wounded or ill wayfarers, regardless of their capacity to compensate. Her medical expertise had preserved countless lives, and many families continued their migrations only because of her intervention. She maintained a fully equipped infirmary in one of the outbuildings, complete with surgical tools and medicines that most frontier physicians could only imagine possessing. The family's reputation for hospitality had grown so powerful that by 1802, travelers commonly sought out the Morrison homestead when planning their journeys. Local scouts regularly directed groups towards Serpent's Creek, assuring them that the Morrisons would provide reasonable prices for provisions and secure lodging for the night. The family's visitor registry, which Faith maintained with careful precision, documented hundreds of guests over the years: traders, clergy, families, and solitary adventurers who had found refuge at the prosperous homestead. He was among the most seasoned and dependable merchants on the mountain trails, a man whose reliability had generated wealth in a world where timing could determine the difference between success and ruinous failure.
For 14 years, he had undertaken the dangerous journey between Pennsylvania and the Carolinas, twice annually, transporting manufactured products south and raw materials north. Thornton's business associate, Robert Whitfield, had collaborated with the merchant long enough to understand his patterns intimately. Thornton never altered his planned itinerary without notification, and he never accepted unnecessary hazards that might endanger his valuable merchandise. When Whitfield received no communication after 6 days, 3 days beyond Thornton's scheduled arrival, he recognized something catastrophic had transpired. Whitfield's investigation commenced at sunrise on November 14th, retracing Thornton's established route backward from Charleston. He questioned innkeepers, traders, and settlers along the path, each confirming that Thornton had passed through punctually. The trail remained distinct until Whitfield reached the vicinity of Willowbrook, where Thornton seemed to have simply evaporated from existence. The discovery of Thornton's horse occurred at midday on the second day of searching. The distinctive chestnut stallion was found wandering loose near Widow's Creek, still bearing its pack saddle but displaying no evidence of injury or distress. The animal appeared well-nourished and groomed, as if it had been intentionally released rather than abandoned in terror. Even more troubling, Thornton's personal belongings were distributed in a deliberate trail leading away from the path toward the deep wilderness, as if he had been compelled to discard them individually while being forced from his mount. The local sheriff, Isaac Garrett, possessed unique qualifications to investigate such mysteries. A former Continental Marine who had served under John Paul Jones in naval campaigns, Garrett combined investigative expertise with the fortitude for violence that frontier law enforcement demanded. He had witnessed sufficient death and deception to understand that obvious explanations were frequently incorrect, and Thornton's disappearance impressed him as anything but ordinary. Garrett assembled a search party within hours of Whitfield's report, recruiting 14 of Willowbrook's most capable men for what he anticipated would be a challenging and potentially hazardous investigation. The searchers included Lars Anderson, a Norwegian immigrant whose tracking abilities matched those of native scouts, and Thomas Pierce, a former manhunter who knew every hideout within 60 miles of town. What the search party uncovered defied logical explanation. Thornton's trail led unmistakably toward the Morrison homestead, marked by fabric fragments snagged on briars and occasional spots of what seemed to be blood. The evidence suggested that the merchant had been conscious but injured when he departed the road, possibly struggling against captors who were dragging him deeper into the wilderness. Even Lars Anderson, whose tracking skills were legendary, acknowledged defeat when confronted with such complete absence of evidence. When Garrett questioned Obadiah Morrison about the missing instead, it struck him as unnaturally flawless, like a narrative that had been carefully rehearsed and practiced until every detail was memorized. Genuine witnesses in Garrett's experience always contradicted each other on minor points while agreeing on major ones. The Morrison account was too polished, too comprehensive, too free of the small discrepancies that characterized authentic testimony. The sheriff's suspicions intensified when he noticed significant alterations in the homestead's layout since his last visit several months earlier. A new smokehouse had been erected near the main barn, unusually massive for a family operation, and built with thick stone walls that seemed designed for more than food preservation. Fresh earth surrounded several outbuildings as if extensive excavation projects. Even Abel and Seth, normally confident and sociable young men, seemed subdued and watchful in ways suggesting they were concealing something significant. But without concrete evidence of wrongdoing, there was little Sheriff Garrett could legally accomplish. Thornton's case was officially documented as a probable highway robbery or Indian attack, his name added to the growing roster of frontier casualties that marked the cost of westward expansion. The merchant's horse was sold at public auction to satisfy his outstanding obligations, and within a month, Marcus Thornton existed only in the memories of those who had known him. Yet, Thornton's disappearance would prove to be merely the beginning of a pattern that would terrorize the mountain trail for the next 10 months, transforming a prosperous farming community into a place where travelers spoke warnings in hushed tones and parents kept their children close to home after sunset. Throughout the winter of 1802 and into the spring of 1803, the disappearances continued with horrifying regularity that defied rational explanation. Every 3 to 4 weeks, another traveler would vanish without explanation along the same stretch of road, creating a zone of terror that extended nearly 25 miles in every direction from Willowbrook. The victims varied dramatically in age, wealth, and traveling circumstances. Solitary merchants like Thornton, small family groups, even heavily armed parties traveling together for mutual protection. What united them was the 45-year-old physician had been transporting his entire professional legacy in the form of medical instruments, texts, and supplies worth over $400, an investment representing years of saving and planning. His wagon had been discovered overturned near Devil's Gorge, 4 miles from the Morrison homestead, with the contents scattered but apparently untouched. Local authorities assumed that Caldwell had been thrown from his seat during an accident and had wandered into the wilderness in confusion, eventually perishing from exposure. The explanation seemed plausible until searchers realized that Caldwell's medical kit was missing from the wreckage. The leather case contained surgical instruments of exceptional quality, including bone saws and amputation equipment that would be invaluable to anyone attempting to practice frontier medicine. No wild creature would have taken such items, and ordinary thieves would have been more interested in the coins and trade goods that remained scattered around the crash site. The Patterson family vanished in January during one of the most severe blizzards in recent memory. William Patterson, his wife Margaret, and their 3 young children had been seeking shelter when their wagon became trapped in a snowdrift only 3/4 of a mile from the Morrison homestead. According to Obadiah's subsequent account, the family had never reached his property despite the short distance, presumably becoming lost in the storm and freezing to death in the wilderness. Their bodies were never located despite extensive searches conducted when the weather cleared. What made the Patterson case particularly disturbing was the discovery of their wagon a week after. Most puzzling of all, tracks around the wagon suggested that multiple people had worked together to free it from the drift, an act that would have required considerable time and effort in dangerous weather. February brought the disappearance of Reverend Daniel Stone, a circuit preacher carrying donations for a new church in Lexington. Stone was known throughout the region for his powerful sermons and his fearless travels through even the most dangerous areas of the frontier. The 52-year-old minister had survived Indian attacks, bandits, and countless natural hazards during 17 years of preaching, making his disappearance particularly shocking to communities that had come to view him as indestructible. Stone's horse was found 4 days after his disappearance, still carrying saddlebags that contained nearly $250 in church donations. The money's presence ruled out robbery as a motive, but raised disturbing questions about what kind of threat could have overcome such an experienced and resourceful man. Local authorities eventually concluded that Stone had suffered a heart attack or stroke while traveling, falling from his horse and dying somewhere in the vast wilderness that surrounded the mountain trail. Each disappearance followed the same inexplicable pattern: abandoned horses found grazing loose or tied to trees, scattered personal belongings suggesting sudden violence or struggle, and trails that led inevitably toward Morrison property before vanishing completely. Yet whenever questioned by increasingly suspicious authorities, the Morrison family presented plausible explanations that were impossible to disprove. They had seen some of the travelers, yes, but only briefly and usually from a distance. Each victim had been warned about. In several cases, the Morrisons had offered food, shelter, or escort services that had been politely declined by travelers who seemed determined to maintain their schedules regardless of risk. Sheriff Garrett found himself trapped in an impossible situation that grew more frustrating with each new disappearance. The Morrisons were among the most respected families in the county, their reputation for charity and Christian virtue unquestioned by everyone except him. Obadiah's sermons continued to draw crowds from surrounding townships, his passionate delivery and biblical knowledge impressing even educated ministers like Reverend Webb. Charity's medical skills had saved dozens of lives during the previous summer's typhoid outbreak, earning her a reputation that bordered on sainthood among grateful families. To accuse such pillars of the community without ironclad proof would be professional suicide and social ostracism. Garrett had seen what happened to lawmen who made accusations they couldn't prove. They found themselves friendless, unemployed, and sometimes facing charges of their own. The frontier operated on a complex web of personal relationships and mutual obligations, and attacking the wrong family could destroy a man's life more effectively than any legal proceeding. Moreover, the family's explanations, while consistently convenient, were entirely believable within the context of frontier life. The mountain trail was genuinely dangerous, plagued by bandits, hostile Indians, severe weather, and the countless natural hazards that claimed lives regularly. Dozens of travelers disappear each year under circumstances far less mysterious. The family welcomed searches of their buildings and grounds, answered questions with apparent openness, and even provided volunteers for search parties that combed the surrounding wilderness for signs of the missing travelers. Their cooperation was so complete and enthusiastic that it felt almost like mockery to the increasingly frustrated sheriff. The first crack in the family's carefully maintained facade came from an unexpected source. 11-year-old Samuel Curtis, whose family lived on a small homestead 3 miles east of the Morrison property. Samuel was known throughout the community as an adventurous child who loved to explore the woods around his family's land, often returning home with elaborate stories about the wildlife and natural wonders he had discovered during his expeditions. In April 1803, young Samuel approached Sheriff Garrett with a story that initially seemed like another product of childish imagination. The boy claimed he had been exploring the woods near Serpent's Creek when he heard screaming coming from the direction of the Morrison homestead. But these weren't the kind of screams that came from accidents, arguments, or even childbirth. They were the sustained, desperate cries of someone in mortal terror, rising and falling in patterns that suggested both physical pain and psychological torment. According to Samuel, he had heard such sounds at least 6 times over the winter, always during the darkest hours of night when decent folk should be asleep. The screaming would continue for what seemed like hours, sometimes accompanied by other sounds that the boy couldn't identify. Rhythmic hammering, the creak of pulleys or ropes, and occasionally what sounded like multiple voices chanting in unison. The sounds always ended. When Garrett questioned the boy's parents, they admitted to hearing strange sounds themselves, but had dismissed them as natural phenomena common to frontier life. Animal calls distorted by wind and distance, perhaps, or the sounds of nocturnal predators hunting in the wilderness. After all, the Morrisons were good Christian folk who had never given anyone cause for suspicion. What possible explanation could there be for screaming in the night coming from such a respectable household? Samuel's account might have been dismissed as childhood imagination or misinterpreted natural sounds, except for one detail that gave Sheriff Garrett considerable pause. When pressed for specifics, the boy could accurately describe the approximate dates when he had heard the screaming, and each corresponded exactly with the estimated time of a traveler's disappearance. The correlation was too precise to be coincidental, too consistent to be explained by chance. Armed with Samuel Curtis's disturbing testimony, Sheriff Garrett began to build a case against the Morrison family, with the methodical patience of a man who understood that accusations against such prominent citizens would require absolutely unassailable proof. He started by quietly interviewing other neighbors who lived within hearing distance of the homestead, asking carefully worded questions that wouldn't reveal his growing suspicions or alert the Morrisons to his investigation. What emerged from these discreet inquiries was a disturbing pattern of small inconsistencies and unexplained phenomena that had been overlooked, dismissed, or rationalized away by people who trusted the family's reputation more than their own observations. Each piece of evidence was Elizabeth Morrison, whose small farm lay closest to the Morrison property, recalled several nights when she had seen unusual activity at their homestead. Lanterns moving between buildings at hours when decent folks should be sleeping. The sounds of digging and heavy construction that seemed to continue until dawn. When she had mentioned these observations to Charity Morrison after church services, the woman had offered a reasonable explanation. The family was working on extensive improvements to their storage cellar and other facilities, and they preferred to do such labor during cool night hours rather than waste precious daylight that could be spent tending crops. The explanation had satisfied Elizabeth at the time, but in retrospect, she realized that the nighttime construction had continued for months, longer than any reasonable building project would require. Moreover, she had never seen evidence of the massive amounts of excavated earth that such extensive digging should have produced. When pressed by Garrett for more details, Elizabeth admitted that the sounds had often been accompanied by what seemed like muffled voices, and occasionally what might have been cries of pain or distress. Old Lars Anderson, whose farm bordered the Morrison property to the north, reported findings that were even more troubling. The Norwegian immigrant, whose tracking and hunting skills were legendary throughout the county, had discovered animal bones scattered along their shared fence line. Not the normal remains of butchered livestock, but bones that had been cracked, gnawed, and processed in ways that suggested something far more sinister than ordinary farming activities. The bones included skulls and long bones from horses, cattle, and pigs, but also smaller fragments that Anderson couldn't identify. Most disturbing of all, some of the bones showed evidence of being deliberately broken with tools, while others bore saw marks that suggested systematic dismemberment rather than natural decomposition or predator activity. When Anderson had approached Obadiah about the mysterious bone deposits, the patriarch had offered a plausible but somehow unsatisfying explanation. Wild animals had been particularly troublesome that winter, he claimed, forcing the family to dispose of several diseased livestock carcasses by scattering the remains throughout the woods. The bone fragments were simply the result of scavengers and weather breaking down these disposed carcasses over time. But Anderson's trained eye had noticed details that contradicted this innocent explanation. The bones were too clean, too systematically processed, and too widely distributed to be the result of natural decomposition. Moreover, many of the fragments showed evidence of being boiled or otherwise treated with heat, suggesting deliberate processing rather than simple disposal of diseased animals. Most tellingly, several neighbors reported dramatic changes in the Morrison family's behavior and demeanor over the past year. The children, once friendly and outgoing members of the community, had become withdrawn and secretive, avoiding social gatherings and speaking only when directly addressed. Abel and Seth, who had previously been popular among young people their age, now seemed nervous and distracted during public interaction. Most disturbing of all, some of the bones showed evidence of being deliberately broken with tools, while others bore saw marks that suggested systematic dismemberment rather than natural decomposition or predator activity. When Anderson had approached Obadiah about the mysterious bone deposits, the patriarch had offered a plausible but somehow unsatisfying explanation. Wild animals had been particularly troublesome that winter, he claimed, forcing the family to dispose of several diseased livestock carcasses by scattering the remains throughout the woods. The bone fragments were simply the result of scavengers and weather breaking down these disposed carcasses over time. But Anderson's trained eye had noticed details that contradicted this innocent explanation. The bones were too clean, too systematically processed, and too widely distributed to be the result of natural decomposition. Moreover, many of the fragments showed evidence of being boiled or otherwise treated with heat, suggesting deliberate processing rather than simple disposal of diseased animals. Most tellingly, several neighbors reported dramatic changes in the Morrison family's behavior and demeanor over the past year. The children, once friendly and outgoing members of the community, had become withdrawn and secretive, avoiding social gatherings and speaking only when directly addressed. Abel and Seth, who had previously been popular among young people their age, now seemed nervous and distracted during public interactions, as if constantly preoccupied with private concerns. Faith Morrison's transformation was particularly striking. The young woman, Fleming, had spent the previous winter in western Pennsylvania, where he had heard disturbing stories about a series of disappearances that had plagued the Monongahela River Valley between 1791 and 1793. According to local accounts, at least 18 travelers had vanished along a remote stretch of road near a prosperous farm operated by a family named Mitchell. Josiah Mitchell, his wife Patience, and their 3 adult children. The similarities between the Pennsylvania disappearances and the current Virginia cases were so striking that they couldn't possibly be coincidental. The pattern was identical. Travelers would be seen heading toward the Mitchell property and would simply vanish, leaving behind only scattered belongings and abandoned horses. Local authorities had suspected the family, but had never been able to prove their involvement, hampered by the same lack of physical evidence that was frustrating Garrett's current investigation. Even more chilling were Fleming's descriptions of the Mitchell family themselves. Josiah was a lay preacher known for his powerful sermons and charitable works, while Patience was respected throughout the region for her exceptional healing abilities. They had arrived in the valley claiming to be refugees from Indian raids with no verifiable history before their sudden appearance. The family was known for their hospitality to travelers and had built a reputation as pillars of their community. When Fleming described the physical appearance of the Mitchell family, Garrett felt his blood turn to ice water. Most damning of all, the Mitchell family had vanished overnight in the autumn of 1793, abandoning their farm and disappearing without explanation, just as suspicion about the disappearances was beginning to focus on their property. Neighbors had found the homestead deserted, with signs of hasty departure and deliberate destruction. Buildings had been partially burned, wells had been filled with rocks and debris, and the entire farm showed evidence of systematic elimination of anything that might provide clues to the family's true identity or activities. When Pennsylvania authorities had finally obtained warrants to search the abandoned Mitchell property, they had made discoveries that still haunted the investigators who participated. Hidden throughout the woods surrounding the farm were dozens of shallow graves containing the remains of both animals and humans. The human remains included personal effects belonging to several of the missing travelers, creating undeniable evidence that the Mitchell family had been responsible for multiple murders. But by then, the killers had vanished completely, leaving behind only their crimes and the mystery of their true identities. A 7-month manhunt had failed to locate any trace of the Mitchell family, and the case had eventually been closed with the assumption that they had either died in the wilderness or fled to territories beyond the reach of American law. Even worse, their current operation in Virginia appeared to be far more sophisticated and successful than their previous activities in Pennsylvania. They had learned from their mistakes, developed better methods of disposing of evidence, and created a more convincing cover identity that had allowed them to operate undetected for 10 years. The number of victims in Virginia likely far exceeded those in Pennsylvania, representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. The weight of Jacob Fleming's testimony pressed down on Sheriff Garrett like a physical burden, but he knew that compelling as the evidence might be, it would not be sufficient to secure convictions against the Morrison family in a court of law. Frontier justice moved deliberately, and judges required ironclad physical evidence before authorizing arrests that could destroy innocent lives and tear apart established communities. The sheriff needed proof that would stand up under the scrutiny of skeptical attorneys and suspicious juries, evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. The breakthrough he desperately needed came from the last source he would have expected: Faith Morrison herself. On the night of June 15, 1803, the 24-year-old woman appeared at Garrett's cabin like a specter materializing from the darkness, her face streaked with tears and her hands trembling with barely controlled terror. What she told him during the next 4 hours would finally expose the full horror of what had been happening at the Morrison homestead, and provide the evidence necessary to bring Virginia's most notorious family of killers to justice. According to Faith's devastating confession, her family had been... But what made her testimony truly horrifying was not just the scope of their crimes, but the methodical, almost ritualistic way in which the murders had been planned and executed. The killing operation, as Faith described it, was far more sophisticated than Garrett had imagined possible. Her father, Obadiah, had convinced the family that they were carrying out God's work by eliminating what he called corrupt souls who traveled the frontier roads. The murders weren't random acts of violence driven by greed or opportunity, but carefully planned executions that served both what Obadiah claimed was divine justice and the family's increasingly elaborate material needs. The process began with what the family called assessment. When promising targets approached the homestead, travelers with valuable goods, significant amounts of money, or skills that the family coveted, Obadiah would engage them in seemingly innocent conversation designed to evaluate their moral character. He would ask about their reasons for traveling, their families, their business dealings, and their religious beliefs, all while presenting himself as a concerned Christian neighbor worried about their safety. Based on these conversations, Obadiah would determine whether each traveler deserved and what he called divine judgment. The wealthy were automatically guilty of greed and materialism. Educated individuals were condemned for pride and intellectual arrogance. Families traveling with young children were accused of recklessly endangering innocent lives. Even ministers and missionaries could be found guilty of false piety or doctrinal errors that marked them as heretics deserving death. Once Obadiah had pronounced his secret verdict, the family would spring into action with the precision of a military operation. They would invite the condemned travelers to stay the night, citing concerns for their safety on dangerous roads, or offering assistance with repairs to wagons or equipment. The family's reputation for hospitality made such invitations almost impossible to refuse, especially during bad weather or when travelers were genuinely in need of help. The doomed visitors would be welcomed into the main house and treated to what appeared to be genuine frontier hospitality. Charity would prepare elaborate meals, showcasing her cooking skills, while the children would entertain guests with music, conversation, and displays of their education and refinement. The evening would conclude with family prayers led by Obadiah, whose powerful voice and biblical knowledge impressed even skeptical visitors. But the final course of every meal contained a carefully prepared mixture of herbs that Charity had perfected over years of experimentation. The drug cocktail was virtually undetectable when mixed with strong coffee or whiskey, producing effects that mimicked natural exhaustion after a long day of travel. Victims would gradually become drowsy. The drugged travelers would awaken to find themselves bound and helpless in the homestead's underground chambers, a complex network of rooms and tunnels that had been excavated far beyond what any normal storage cellar would require. According to Faith's terrified description, the subterranean complex stretched for nearly 300 yards from the main house, with multiple levels connected by stone steps and wooden ladders. The largest chamber served as what Obadiah called his tribunal, a grotesque parody of legal proceedings, complete with a makeshift judge's bench carved from limestone, iron shackles set into the stone walls, and religious symbols that had been perverted into instruments of terror. Here, Obadiah would preside over formal trials that determined each captive's final fate, presenting evidence of their supposed sins and delivering verdicts that were predetermined before the proceedings even began. But the trials were not merely sadistic theater. They served a practical purpose in the family's twisted psychology. By framing the murders as acts of divine justice rather than simple crimes, Obadiah had created a belief system that allowed his family to commit atrocities while maintaining their self-image as righteous Christians. Each killing became a religious duty, each victim a sacrifice offered to purify the frontier of unworthy souls. The sentences handed down in Obadiah's underground tribunal varied according to his assessment of each victim's sins and the family's current needs. Some prisoners were kept alive for weeks or even months, forced to use their skills. The drugged travelers would awaken to find themselves bound and helpless in the homestead's underground chambers, a complex network of rooms and tunnels that had been excavated far beyond what any normal storage cellar would require. According to Faith's terrified description, the subterranean complex stretched for nearly 300 yards from the main house, with multiple levels connected by stone steps and wooden ladders. The largest chamber served as what Obadiah called his tribunal, a grotesque parody of legal proceedings, complete with a makeshift judge's bench carved from limestone, iron shackles set into the stone walls, and religious symbols that had been perverted into instruments of terror. Here, Obadiah would preside over formal trials that determined each captive's final fate, presenting evidence of their supposed sins and delivering verdicts that were predetermined before the proceedings even began. But the trials were not merely sadistic theater. They served a practical purpose in the family's twisted psychology. By framing the murders as acts of divine justice rather than simple crimes, Obadiah had created a belief system that allowed his family to commit atrocities while maintaining their self-image as righteous Christians. Each killing became a religious duty, each victim a sacrifice offered to purify the frontier of unworthy souls. The sentences handed down in Obadiah's underground tribunal varied according to his assessment of each victim's sins and the family's current needs. Some prisoners were kept alive for weeks or even months. Her knowledge of anatomy, gained through years of frontier medical practice, had been perverted into expertise in torture and murder. Most chilling of all, Charity had developed what she called treatments for prisoners who proved uncooperative or attempted to escape. These punishments were designed to break the will without causing death, using techniques that combined her medical knowledge with psychological torture. Prisoners who refused to comply with the family's demands would find themselves subjected to calculated doses of pain and terror until they became completely submissive. The family's success in avoiding detection had depended on more than just careful planning. It required an elaborate system of disposal and deception that eliminated all evidence of their crimes. Bodies were never buried on the homestead property itself, but were instead transported through the cave system to remote limestone caverns that lay several miles from the main house. These natural chambers provided perfect conditions for decomposition, while their distance from the homestead made discovery virtually impossible. Personal belongings were sorted with the efficiency of experienced merchants. Valuable items, money, jewelry, fine weapons, and tools were either kept by the family or sold in distant markets where they couldn't be traced to missing persons. Less valuable objects were carefully scattered along roads throughout the region, creating false trails that suggested robbery or Indian attacks. Even victims' clothing was processed systematically, with useful garments kept for the family's use, while distinctive items were destroyed to prevent identification. The horses presented by selling the horses far from where their owners had disappeared, the Morrisons created additional false trails that further confused investigations. But perhaps the most ingenious aspect of their deception was the way they used their charitable activities to deflect suspicion. Every act of kindness, every medical treatment provided by Charity, every sermon delivered by Obadiah served dual purposes. They genuinely helped the community while creating a reputation that made the family virtually above suspicion. Who would believe that people who saved lives during epidemics could be responsible for systematic murder? The family had even developed contingency plans for different types of investigations. If authorities became too suspicious, they would temporarily cease their killing activities while increasing their charitable works to reinforce their reputation. They had identified several escape routes that would allow them to abandon the homestead quickly if discovery seemed imminent, just as they had done when leaving Pennsylvania years earlier. According to Faith, the family had been planning to expand their operations significantly. They had identified several other remote homesteads along the mountain trail where similar operations could be conducted, creating a network of killing sites that would allow them to operate with even greater impunity. The ultimate goal was to establish what Obadiah called courts of divine justice throughout the frontier, eliminating unworthy travelers on a scale that would reshape the moral character of the entire region. But what finally drove Faith to confession was not moral awakening or a sudden conscience. It was terror for her own life. She revealed that Obadiah had grown increasingly. That list now included several neighbors who had asked too many questions. Jacob Fleming, the merchant who had been making inquiries about the Pennsylvania disappearances, and even Sheriff Garrett himself. More immediately terrifying, Faith disclosed that another victim was currently being held in the underground chambers. A traveling surveyor named Henry Blackstone, who had been captured 4 days earlier and was scheduled for trial the following night. But Blackstone was not the only prisoner in the family's custody. Unknown to the outside world, they were also holding 2 other captives. A young woman named Catherine Wells, who had been missing for over a week, and an elderly man identified as Ezra Thornfield, a traveling minister who had disappeared the previous month. The revelation that multiple victims were being held simultaneously showed how confident the family had become in their methods and how dramatically they had escalated their activities. What had begun as opportunistic murders of isolated travelers had evolved into something approaching an industrial killing operation, with prisoners being held, sorted, and executed according to an elaborate schedule that treated human life as raw material for the family's twisted purposes. Garrett realized that time had run out for careful investigation and legal procedures. If Faith's information was accurate, innocent people were going to die within hours unless immediate action was taken. But he also knew that a direct confrontation with the Morrison family would be extraordinarily dangerous. They were armed, prepared for resistance, and operating from a fortified position. He could attempt to arrest the Morrison family single-handed, risking not only his own life, but potentially alerting them to escape before their current victims could be rescued. Alternatively, he could ride to Richmond for reinforcements, almost certainly condemning Blackstone, Wells, and Thornfield to death, while giving the Morrisons time to destroy evidence and flee to another territory where they could resume their killing spree. The choice became easier when Garrett realized he wouldn't have to act alone. Lars Anderson, the Norwegian farmer whose suspicions had been growing for months, volunteered immediately when approached for assistance. The immigrant's military experience in the Swedish army and his intimate knowledge of the local terrain made him an invaluable ally for what would essentially be a combat operation. Jacob Fleming also volunteered his services, driven by guilt over his failure to expose the Mitchell family's crimes in Pennsylvania years earlier. The merchant's knowledge of the family's previous methods and his experience with frontier violence would be crucial in anticipating their likely responses to attack. Two other men from town, Thomas Pierce, the former manhunter, and Samuel Morrison, a veteran of Indian fighting, completed the hastily assembled rescue party. The plan they developed was necessarily simple but extremely dangerous. The group would approach the Morrison homestead after midnight on June 16th, using darkness and surprise to overcome the family's defensive advantages. Their primary objective was rescuing the imprisoned victims, with capturing the killers being a secondary consideration. If the Morrisons could not be taken alive, the rescuers were prepared to use whatever force necessary to prevent their escape. Faith provided crucial intelligence about the homestead's layout and the family's likely defensive positions. The underground complex had only two entrances, the main access through the enlarged storage cellar and a concealed emergency exit that emerged in the woods nearly half a mile from the main house. The family kept weapons cached at both locations, and Obadiah had drilled his sons in defensive tactics designed to hold off attackers long enough for the family to escape through the cave system. The approach to the homestead required crossing nearly 2 miles of open ground that would leave the rescuers completely exposed if detected. Anderson's tracking skills proved invaluable in identifying a route that used creek beds and tree lines to provide maximum concealment. The group moved with the silence of experienced hunters, each man understanding that discovery would likely mean death for both themselves and the prisoners they were trying to save. What they discovered when they reached the Morrison property exceeded their worst expectations and confirmed that Faith's testimony had actually understated the scope of her family's crimes. The homestead showed clear evidence of recent excavation work, far beyond what any normal agricultural operation would require. Piles of earth and stone were scattered throughout the property, while the smell of lime and decay hung in the air like a physical presence. The main house appeared normal from the outside, with warm light glowing in the windows and smoke rising from the chimneys. But as the rescuers drew closer, they could hear sounds that chilled their blood. Muffled voices coming from beneath the ground, occasional screams that were quickly silenced, and the rhythmic sound of metal striking stone that suggested ongoing construction work in the underground chambers. The rescue operation began at precisely 3 o'clock in the morning, when the raiders believed the family. Garrett and Anderson approached the main entrance to the underground complex, while Pierce and Morrison positioned themselves to block the emergency exit. Fleming remained with the horses, ready to provide covering fire if the operation went wrong. The storage cellar entrance proved to be far more elaborate than Faith had described. What appeared from the surface to be a simple storage facility was actually a sophisticated fortification with multiple defensive positions and clear fields of fire. The Morrisons had spent years preparing for exactly this type of assault, creating killing zones that would allow a small number of defenders to hold off a much larger attacking force. But the raiders' greatest advantage was complete surprise. The family had grown complacent after years of successful operation, never imagining that their carefully maintained cover could be penetrated by local law enforcement. When Garrett and Anderson descended into the underground complex, they found Obadiah and his sons completely unprepared for resistance, focused instead on the grisly business of preparing their current victims for execution. The rescue bones, clothing fragments, and personal effects were scattered throughout multiple rooms, creating an archaeological record of atrocity that would take weeks to fully catalog. The physical evidence was overwhelming, in both scope and detail. In addition to the human remains, the raiders found the detailed records that Faith had described, written in her careful handwriting and organized with the precision of a merchant's ledger. The notebooks contained the names, descriptions, and final possessions of 83 victims spanning 10 years, far more than the investigation had uncovered, and representing one of the most extensive killing sprees in American criminal history. But perhaps the most damning evidence was discovered in what Obadiah had called his tribunal. The underground chamber contained not only the makeshift judge's bench and religious symbols that Faith had described, but also a collection of personal trophies taken from victims. Scalps, jewelry, weapons, and other mementos were displayed like battle honors, creating a museum of murder that revealed the full extent of the family's sadistic pride in their crimes. The capture of the Morrison family proved to be swift but violent, as Obadiah and his sons attempted to fight their way out of the underground complex rather than face the justice they had denied their victims. The patriarch showed no surprise at being discovered, instead launching into a rambling sermon about divine judgment and the righteousness of his mission. Even as gunfire echoed through the stone chambers, Abel and Seth fought with the desperate fury of men who knew they faced certain death if captured, using their intimate knowledge of the case system to launch attacks from concealed positions. The battle raged through multiple chambers for nearly 2 hours, with the raiders forced to advance carefully through passages that the defenders had prepared as killing zones. The end came when Charity, trapped in the main house above, attempted to destroy evidence by setting fire to the building and its contents. The flames spread rapidly through the dry timber structure, threatening to collapse the main entrance to the underground complex and trap everyone below. Faced with the choice between burning alive and surrendering, the surviving Morrisons finally laid down their weapons. Only Faith surrendered willingly, her confession having already condemned her family and sealed their fate. She was found in her room kneeling in prayer and apparently resigned to whatever judgment awaited her. Her cooperation with the investigation had been motivated not by moral awakening, but by terror that her father's paranoia would eventually mark her for execution along with the family's other perceived enemies. The aftermath of the Morrison family's capture sent shockwaves throughout Virginia and the broader frontier region, forcing communities to confront the terrifying reality that one of their most respected families had been systematically murdering travelers for over a decade. The evidence recovered from the underground complex was so overwhelming and disturbing that local authorities struggled to process the full scope of the crimes. The investigation that followed the raid revealed details that exceeded even the raiders' worst expectations. The cave system beneath the Morrison homestead was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, stretching for nearly 3 miles through natural limestone caverns that the family had modified for their murderous purposes. Multiple chambers had been excavated and reinforced, creating an underground complex that could house dozens of prisoners simultaneously. In addition to the 83 victims documented in Faith's careful records, searchers found personal effects and human remains that suggested the true number of murders was significantly higher. Particularly disturbing was the discovery of children's clothing and toys among the recovered evidence, indicating that entire families had been murdered rather than just individual travelers. The Patterson family, who had disappeared during the January blizzard, were found to have been held in the underground complex for over 2 weeks before being executed. Their children, ages 5, 7, and 9, had been kept alive for several days after their parents' deaths before being killed and their bodies disposed of in the deepest parts of the cave system. The trial of the Morrison family began in late August 1803 and lasted for nearly 6 weeks, drawing spectators from across Virginia and the surrounding territories. The courthouse in Richmond was packed daily with crowds that included victims' relatives, curious onlookers, and legal experts who recognized the case as unprecedented in American criminal history. The evidence presented was so overwhelming and disturbing that the presiding judge, Honorable William Marshall, ordered portions of the testimony sealed from public view. Obadiah Morrison's behavior during the trial shocked even experienced court observers. Rather than showing remorse for his crimes or attempting to minimize his family's responsibility, he used his testimony as an opportunity to deliver extended sermons about
The money and goods taken from victims weren't theft, but righteous compensation for their sacred work. The elaborate underground complex wasn't a prison, but a courthouse where God's justice was administered according to biblical principles. His wife and sons maintained their innocence despite overwhelming evidence, insisting they had been coerced into participating by Obadiah's religious fanaticism and threats of violence. Charity claimed that her medical knowledge had been used against her will to keep prisoners alive, while Abel and Seth testified that their father had convinced them they were fighting a holy war against agents of Satan who threatened their community. These claims were contradicted by extensive evidence showing that all family members had participated willingly and enthusiastically in the murders. Faith's detailed records included notations in different handwritings, indicating that each family member had contributed to documenting their crimes. Personal items found in their rooms included trophies taken from victims, suggesting that the killings provided psychological satisfaction rather than mere material gain. Only Faith Morrison expressed genuine remorse for her role in the murders, though her testimony revealed that her cooperation with authorities had been motivated primarily by fear rather than moral awakening. She provided crucial details about the family's methods and helped identify many of the victims whose remains had been found in the cave system. Her willingness to testify against her family members earned her a degree of mercy from prosecutors, though she would still face severe punishment for her participation.
The date was chosen deliberately to mark exactly 1 year since Marcus Thornton's disappearance had first exposed the family's crimes and begun the investigation that led to their capture. Faith Morrison received the sentence of life imprisonment, sparing her from execution in exchange for her cooperation with the authorities and her use at the time many of the crimes were committed. She would spend the remaining 37 years of her life in the Virginia State Penitentiary, becoming one of the longest-serving prisoners in the institution's history.
The executions drew the largest crowd in Virginia's history to that point, with over 5,000 people traveling from throughout the region to witness the end of the frontier's most notorious family of killers. The event took on an almost carnival atmosphere, with vendors selling food and drink to spectators who had made long journeys to see justice served. Obadiah maintained his religious fanaticism to the very end, using his final words to deliver a rambling sermon in which he cursed the community that had rejected his vision of divine justice. He predicted that God would punish Virginia for executing his chosen servants, and that the frontier would be overrun by the very sinners his family had worked to eliminate. His wife and sons died in silence, their deaths bringing closure to one of the darkest chapters in early American criminal history. The Morrison homestead was burned to the ground immediately after the executions, with every building reduced to ash and rubble in a ceremony that took on rich. But the legacy of the Morrison family's crimes extended far beyond their own deaths, establishing important precedents in frontier justice and fundamentally changing how communities viewed the balance between hospitality and security. The case led to new laws requiring background verification for land purchases and established protocols for investigating missing persons that would influence law enforcement practices for decades. More importantly, the Morrison case served as a chilling warning about the dangers of blind trust in religious authority and the ease with which evil could hide behind a facade of respectability. Communities throughout the frontier began questioning their assumptions about neighbors and strangers alike, recognizing that surface appearances could mask the darkest intentions. The legal proceedings also established important precedents for the use of circumstantial evidence in capital cases and the protection of witnesses who cooperated with authorities. Faith Morrison's testimony demonstrated that family loyalty could be overcome by proper incentives and legal protections, paving the way for similar prosecutions in other complex criminal cases. The surviving records of the case were sealed by court order in 1805, with access restricted to law enforcement officials and legal scholars. This decision was made partly to protect the privacy of victims' families, but also to prevent the case from inspiring copycat crimes by other twisted individuals who might see the Morrison methods as a blueprint for their own murderous ambitions. For nearly 2 centuries, the full truth about the Morrison family remained hidden in those sealed documents, with even local memory gradually forgot the specific details of the murders, transforming the story into vague tales of evil folk who had once lived along Serpent's Creek. The location of the homestead itself became uncertain as property lines changed and new settlers arrived who knew nothing of the area's dark history. By the mid-1800s, only a few elderly residents could accurately point out where the Morrison property had stood. The rediscovery of the case files in 1994 finally allowed historians to piece together the complete story of Virginia's first family of serial killers. But even today, many questions remain unanswered. The cave system where the family disposed of their victims has never been fully explored, and authorities believe additional remains may still be hidden in the deepest passages that were too dangerous for 19th century investigators to access. Modern forensic techniques could potentially reveal much more about the family's crimes, but the sealed caverns would be extremely difficult and expensive to excavate. Local authorities have shown little interest in reopening what they consider a historical matter, preferring to let the dead rest undisturbed rather than risk new revelations that might traumatize descendants of the victims. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the Morrison case has forced historians to reconsider other unexplained disappearances along frontier roads throughout the early American period. How many other respectable families might have been hiding similar secrets? How many missing travelers were victims not of random violence, natural hazards, or Indian attacks, but of carefully planned murders by people they trusted? Statistical analysis of frontier disappearances reveals troubling patterns that even local memory gradually forgot the specific details of the murders, transforming the story into vague tales of evil folk who had once lived along Serpent's Creek. The location of the homestead itself became uncertain as property lines changed and new settlers arrived who knew nothing of the area's dark history. By the mid-1800s, only a few elderly residents could accurately point out where the Morrison property had stood. The rediscovery of the case files in 1994 finally allowed historians to piece together the complete story of Virginia's first family of serial killers. But even today, many questions remain unanswered. The cave system where the family disposed of their victims has never been fully explored, and authorities believe additional remains may still be hidden in the deepest passages that were too dangerous for 19th century investigators to access. Modern forensic techniques could potentially reveal much more about the family's crimes, but the sealed caverns would be extremely difficult and expensive to excavate. Local authorities have shown little interest in reopening what they consider a historical matter, preferring to let the dead rest undisturbed rather than risk new revelations that might traumatize descendants of the victims. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the Morrison case has forced historians to reconsider other unexplained disappearances along frontier roads throughout the early American period. How many other respectable families might have been hiding similar secrets? How many missing travelers were victims not of random violence, natural hazards, or Indian attacks, but of carefully planned murders by people they trusted? Statistical analysis of frontier disappearances reveals troubling patterns that suggest the Morrison family may not have been unique. Clusters of vanishings near other prosperous charitable families have been identified in Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky during the same time period.